This is Michael Walsh, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
That's what we do. So Michael's here to talk about his latest book. It's a sequel of sorts. Is that not correct, Michael? I mean, or is this a true sequel, or is it just like another chapter in the multi-volume universe when it comes to writing combat?
It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's a follow-on book to a book I did a couple of years ago called Last Stands,
right?
Which was about famous last stands in history. And the new book is called A Rage to Conquer. There it is.
There it is.
And it's about great battles in Western history and the great commanders who commanded them to victory. So it's like its predecessor is a cultural history as much as a military history. You'll get description of the battles, but you'll also get the cultural context, sometimes quite wide, of why this happened when and what else was going on in the world. So hopefully the readers will like it as much as they did Last Stands, and we'll be moving on to a third book after we're done with this one.
Well, let's not get too far ahead. Let's talk about A Rage to Conquer. Yeah, and it's great. I was going to comment on that right away. It was just the amount of texts that you withdraw quotes from. So, whoever it is, Cicero, whoever you're quoting, but you're also giving that, it's like when I read any kind of book, whatever it is, there's all kinds of books above my shelf here. And when the author is referencing things, I'm often in that text or in references that are similar to that text, just trying to understand the context of the time. And you do a lot of that work for me when I read the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed that about the book.
Well, thank you. Well, I think you should tell the story in their own words as much as you can. Obviously, we don't have firsthand witnesses to things like the sack of Troy. We have Homer writing hundreds of years later about it. We don't have firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great that have come down to us. They were written, but they've been lost. But what we do have is next generation historians who had access to them and based their work on that. So I've done as much primary source and secondary source quoting and scene setting as we can to make it interesting too. So you don't want it to become overly filled with quotes. But I think it works pretty well, all things considered.
What are the things that happens in combat? Like, I'll be in a firefight and it'll last a certain amount of time. If you ask everybody how long it took, anywhere from like 18 seconds to 3 hours, any kind of span in that is possible. And all the different versions, no one's lying, but there's so much going on. It's funny that when you write about, what happened, but there's certain things you just can't know. And those things cause other things. So like in here, you talk about the Battle of the Bulge and Patton and everything else, but there's guys that jump in and they're called the Nasty 13. You probably know this, but when they jump in, the leader of those guys, Jack, he jumps in and he's like, I'm not bringing the don't send supplies smoke signal. I'm just bringing the one that brings the supplies because we're going to make this happen.
Yeah.
And so that's nothing to do with Patton, right? But this one compelling force, this one unit, this one dude who's like, we are going. If there's a crack of sunshine in the sky, get us on that plane. We're going to jump in. We don't care that it's dangerous. We care that it has to get done, right? And so these things are not available to a commander who's in another part of the battle driving tanks. He's just relying on some breaks going his way and be ready to seize the opportunity when it presents itself.
Well, I talk about Clausewitz in the very first chapter of the book, who is the great military theoretician, veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, Prussian officer, who was captured at the Battle of Jena, which was a resounding French victory, and spent some time in captivity and then returned to Prussia and eventually fought Napoleon again with the Russians later at Waterloo, in fact. Clausewitz talks about friction, which is it's kind of the Mike Tyson philosophy of battle. Everyone's got a plan until they get hit in the mouth. And then that's when friction takes over. And so a lot of these discussions will be about friction and how it's the unpredictable element. It's chance. War is a game of chance in many ways that takes over, and then you don't know. When you're Napoleon on that battlefield and it's 2 or 3 miles wide, you can't see the whole thing. You're dependent on lines of communication, communiques from your marshals in the field as to what is going on, which means what happened 20 minutes ago. So you're making judgments on the fly. And I think what distinguishes someone like Napoleon, for example, and Patton too, is they know what's going to happen given them enough information. They can predict what the enemy's going to do before he knows what he's going to do and before it actually happens. And that certainly happened at Austerlitz, which is the battle I talk about the most in this particular book. But things can go wrong. Some battles, you mentioned the timing of them. The Bulge lasted several days, but the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in which Constantine defeated the other Western Roman emperor, lasted about an hour max, maybe less. Sort of like the Battle of San Jacinto in the Texas Revolution. That lasted, 14 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
So you just can't tell. Battles have an arc to them, and sometimes they take 3 days. Mostly they take 1 day, especially among the ancients, because there's the sun and then it's dark. So you're fighting during the daylight hours, and hopefully during the summer when the weather's better than it is if you're fighting through winter sludge. And most of those battles were over within a matter of hours, I would say.
Yeah.
But each one is different, and each one takes a certain amount of time to develop, and then you get the result. I quote Napoleon in this book. It's a quote that's disputed by Napoleonic scholars, but I like it very much, and other writers have used it, including Sir Evelyn Baring, who went to Sandhurst, the military academy, was in Egypt when General Gordon was killed at Khartoum. The quote is, "Show up to the battlefield and see what happens." And scholars say, well, Napoleon would never do that. But I think actually he would do that. He would plan it. And then what he's saying is, then you get hit in the mouth and all bets are off and we'll have to take it from there. But he was a great improviser. He was always better on the attack than he was on the defense. When he loses on defense effectively, even at Waterloo. And that was the end of him. Anyway, it's a fascinating study into the minds of these guys. What they had in common was one of the key points I wanted to make. Alexander the Great has a lot in common with Napoleon, has a lot in common with Julius Caesar, has a lot in common with Patton. And as you know, Patton thought he was kind of the reincarnation of all these guys. Certainly, he had been a Roman legionary in one past life and God knows what else. So they feel a real kinship to each other, and they know each other when they see each other, even though they're separated by centuries and sometimes millennia.
Yeah, when you to become a good warrior, at some point you've got to read these old texts and understand as best you can how it applies to what you're doing now, and it becomes very familiar. Like you want to go see all of these places, this pass or this lake or this bridge or whatever it is, and I try while I travel to not look around and be like, over there, that's Remagen, one exit over. But you can't avoid it. Like you just know, like that's Remagen. Bad things happen there, hard battles, and so it is all encompassing if you're a warrior.
I think that's true. And I think if you're a student of military history, it really helps to see the battlefield. Now, remember, battlefields have changed.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Thermopylae is nothing like it was when the Spartans were holding the pass. It's changed by man, it's changed by nature, erosion, what have you. The ground has been leveled out, or there's been movement of the earth, and now it's slightly different. But you still get the sense that you're in a hallowed ground. And I think I grew up in the Marine Corps, so I have that sense imbued into me from childhood that some of these battlefields are like sacred spaces. And we recognize that as a culture. We have preserved the Gettysburg. I mean, you can stand right where the high water mark of Pickett's charge was and say, what the heck were they thinking coming across all this open space in the teeth of this tremendous cannon fire? These guys obviously had courage to burn. Or you can go, and another example, it's not a battlefield, but it's the military cemetery at Normandy. That's like being in the biggest outdoor cathedral ever made. You won't hear a sound except nature. Nobody says anything. If you speak, you're speaking very quietly. There's people going to look for the graves of their grandfather or other relatives. But it's this hushed sacredness about it that I found so interesting.
Yeah, and some of these battlefields are just simply not really accessible. I mean, to get to Iwo Jima, I'm sure they do tours from here time to time, but that is a significant commitment. And you're not going there for anything other than that experience of just walking around and being gobsmacked by how impossible it all is.
Yeah. Well, I actually grew up overlooking Pearl Harbor, was one of our duty stations. So every day I went down the hill to school, there was a visible reminder of World War II, the beginning of the American involvement in the Second World War, right there. And when I first got there, I think the Oklahoma was still sticking out of the water. I don't think it had been completely raised. And the Arizona Memorial was pretty new at that point. There were still buildings at Hospital Point were still pockmarked. And in the area we lived for military officers, people were still digging Japanese ordnance out of their yard. So that was 1962 or 3, and it's not that long after the end of the war. So wars leave a scar, and it resonates. And I wasn't old enough or smart enough to really appreciate what I was looking, but at least I understood what it meant, what it symbolized to those men who died there and the men who fought.
Yeah. It's I don't know if you've been to the World War I Museum in Kansas City, the national one, but it moves you. And we're seeing the tip of the pen, like the ink on top of the ball, on top of the tip of the pen of what is there. And when you walk in, this is for the audience. When you walk in, you walk over an elevated, like a glass floor, and below it is a field of poppies, and they represent the death. And it's not an easy thing to walk across and not feel that thing. And then you walk through, and there's all kinds of incredible displays of what it would be like to be in a foxhole, and physically you're in like a cross section of one, and you can see what it means to do that. And you see all of the art that the guys were doing, in the trenches waiting, because a lot of these guys were artisans. So they're welding and they're shaping metal into these beautiful things, while above it's all horror, and so you see these things. Gosh, it's hard not to be moved by the Arizona, the World War I Museum. These are incredible places.
Yeah, I haven't been to that. It's in Kansas City, Missouri, did you say?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I will definitely. I've written a lot about World War I, and the whole notion of static trench warfare is so alien to anyone either before or after. That war was unique in that sense. It's got to be extremely moving. I've been following on this trip. I'm in Budapest, Hungary at the moment. I've been following in part Napoleon around Europe to go to various battle sites, and I was just recently at Jena, as a matter of fact. There's just something magical about being there if it resonates with you. But one of the larger points I've made in this book is it's really about men. It's about the masculine art of war, and it's too easy to say war is awful, it's horrible, and we should outlaw it. One, it's never going to happen, and two, it's all of those things. But it's also, if you talk to any veteran who survived, they'll say that was the best time of my life. And the reason they say that is I was never more alive at the edge of death than I was as a 23-year-old kid hitting the beach or my dad was a 24-year-old kid hitting Incheon in Korea, and then later fighting at the Chosin Reservoir, suddenly surrounded by Chinese just a day or two after Thanksgiving, and fighting his way out. I don't know that he personally would say that, but a lot of veterans I've talked to do say that. And I think it's wrong for people to say war is always bad, because I make the point in the introduction to this book, it's actually the thing that moves civilization forward, even though that's a horrible thing to say. It's an innovator, it creates new technology, and it puts men, not women, but men, to a test that only men can go through. For example, during the election campaign, Donald Trump ran an ad which used bits of Full Metal Jacket from Stanley Kubrick's movie, with Lee Ermey, may he rest in peace, playing the Marine drill sergeant at Parris Island. And it's pretty rough. You know, if you saw that movie, you thought, wow, I'm glad I didn't have that DI when I was in the service. And some immediately said, oh, that's terrible. Kubrick would never have wanted it to be used by that, blah, blah, blah. And then Kubrick's daughter came out and said, that's exactly what he would have liked. If you look at the movies of Kubrick, starting with, say, Paths of Glory, Spartacus, look how many war movies he made. Spartacus, Full Metal Jacket. These are explorations of men under extreme pressure in a lethal, hostile environment. And I think Kubrick was interested in, how do you react to that? If you think back to Paths of Glory, which is that World War I trench movie, the French soldiers are ordered to go up and over the top, even though they know they're going to get ripped to shreds by machine gun fire. And they do, and they're ripped to shreds by the machine gun fire. And the French commanders are so angry, they want to blame it on somebody else. So they tell the officers to pick 3 guys, and they're going to be shot for cowardice, no matter what, whether they were guilty or not. And just to sort of assuage the honor of the unit. And Kirk Douglas plays the officer who's in charge of defending them. So it's a fantastic war movie, and then it turns into a courtroom drama as well. And I think that's something that, as Americans, we've lost. I mean, name the last war we won. Well, it ended on the decks of the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. That's it. We didn't win anything since then. It was a stalemate in Korea. Vietnam, we left ignominiously. Most recently, the Afghan war, we abandoned just because we could. This is not a great record for the American military, but it's because they don't fight to win anymore. They fight not to lose. And that's just unacceptable to my way of thinking.
Yeah, and actually, I had some things set up in my mind to ask you about that. But I want to go back in time a little bit and talk about when you get into the texts, all of them, and you're trying to decide what 12 battles, and you're also considering, how does war change, right? So it seems like it's all the same until about Civil War, and then it starts to modernize really fast. But there's all kinds of innovation constantly, and you talked about this a second ago. Also, tragedy begats advancements. If the Titanic doesn't sink, and no ships ever sink, we don't need so many lifeboats. It's like these things have to happen. So, what were some things that you picked up that you saw in terms of patterns of the different conflicts? What battles didn't make it into the book that are deserving, but you're only going to write 12 stories?
Well, that's a tough question, because I really don't know how to answer that question, because the battles that I chose came pretty quickly to me as I was going through the research. So I don't remember, obviously, what I left out was lots. Some of them I did in Last Stands. But the ones that I did pick, I picked for the reasons that they actually turned the tide of what might have been foreseeable history. And the other reason I picked them is how they showed different commanders in the same situation. And I'll give you an example of this. I chose, of all the battles that Caesar fought, I chose the last of the Gallic War battles against Vercingetorix, the Gallic Celtic commander. And it was an amazing feat of generalship on Caesar's part. And it was an amazing feat of construction, because the Romans weren't just fighters. They were kind of mobile army corps of engineers. They could build an entire encampment out of wood in a day, and then take it down the next day and move on. The reason they won so consistently was because of discipline, and also because their engineering was the best in the world. So just to make a long story short, Caesar has the Celts trapped in a walled city. The first thing he does is build another wall around it. So now they really can't get out. But some of them managed to get out before the wall was finished, and they sent for help. And help comes, and it's another 150,000 guys. So Caesar goes and builds another wall around himself to protect him from the Celtic reinforcements. So now you have the people in the city, they're trying to get out, break through that wall. The other people trying to break into that wall. The Romans are incredibly outnumbered. But they have luck on their side in this. They could force the battle to the point where the topography worked for them. This is what the Greeks did at the hot baths at Thermopylae. They made this immense Persian army come through one little door where they could kill them one at a time. And that gave them tactical parity. Now, eventually they were attacked from the rear, and once the enemy gets in your rear, you're pretty much done. Yeah. So Caesar had to win this fight in both directions. And 1,000 years later, Bohemond of Taranto, one of the leaders of the First Crusade, is in the exact analogous position at Antioch, where he's broken into the city, but the keep, the hardest part of the city to break, is still in Turkish hands. And they're sallying out to attack the Christians who are now in charge of the city, but a giant Muslim army has appeared outside the walls. Yeah. So now you see Bohemond and Caesar are in the same spot. And how did each one of those guys deal with that? And for me, it was interesting that both of them dealt with it in the same way the Greeks did. They went to the choke point and attacked the enemy there, because the enemy had to be everywhere, and you only have to be in one place. So that's asymmetrical warfare at its best, right? As the IRA said when Mrs. Thatcher, when they almost killed her with the bomb, you have to be right every time. We only have to be lucky once. Yeah. And so this is what the Crusaders did. They attacked out one gate, and they defeated it, demoralized the army that was right in front of them. And then, as often happened in those early battles against the Turks broke and ran, because they get demoralized when they start to lose. And the Crusaders were able to win the Battle of Antioch. So I just find that fascinating, how history recurs. And the good commanders know that, either instinctively or they've, as you mentioned earlier, they've studied it. Now, we used to study this at West Point and elsewhere. Now we're studying DEI and pronouns instead of siege warfare. And it's not going well for us. That's the point.
But it definitely doesn't. I'm reading a book called Blitzed by Norman Ohler. He's a German author, and he talks about the advantage of methamphetamines and other things that the Nazis used. And part of the Blitzkrieg was, we're just not going to sleep. We're just going to be high, and we're going to smash through. But over time, if you make a bunch of drug addicts, in your military, they also tend to struggle. And so like this tortoise and hare kind of thing comes into play, I imagine. Yeah. Does that use of drugs, did you find that at all when you were examining these other fights? Because surely there's plants and other things.
Not really. No. I think, well, look, people, if you look at the 19th century, ordinary people drank an immense amount of alcohol every single day in a way that we'd all be wasted from. But they managed to function quite well, and you never could tell. So I didn't find that to be a factor. What I found is that when the commander loses the affection of his men, then you're in trouble. So Alexander never lost a battle. And he went all the way to the Hydaspes River in what's now Pakistan, India. But that was the point where his men said, we're done. We're not going to fight anymore. We're going to go home. And if you don't like it, tough. And so he had to then turn that army around and start marching back towards Mesopotamia. He died in Babylon. But his men had just finally had enough. They had signed up to, fight a fight or two in what's now Turkey. They didn't expect to go almost all the way to China.
Yeah.
And that's when he stopped. Caesar stopped when the last of the Gallic rebellion was put down. But he was also out of time. He was fighting a totally illegal war. The Roman Senate kept saying, yo, dude, what, right? We didn't authorize this. He knew that he was going to be charged as a criminal and maybe executed when he came back to Rome, especially when he crossed the border between Rome and not Rome. That is this little river, Rubicon in northeastern Italy. So he knew he was going to have to fight at that point. But he had to come back and face the political consequences of his own ambition and greed. That's usually what ends up stopping them. Napoleon, made the fatal mistake of marching on Moscow. Mm-hmm. And after that, his army had been destroyed. And he lost after the 100 days when he returned from exile and raised an army and went up and got beat at Waterloo. He would say later on, he didn't write his memoirs, but one of his secretaries did. And he would say, if I had had the army of Austerlitz at XYZ battle, I would have won. Because that was his most fit, toughest, best force that France probably ever raised. And they were ready to fight, and they were ready to go all the way to the end. And unfortunately, you can't keep an army together. Once it breaks or disbands, you have to start all over again.
Sometimes circumstance pushes you to where you have to make an A or a B decision. Sometimes this is made for you. There's no way out of it. I'm thinking about Francisco Orellana, who goes over the top of the Andes working on doing a recce, and then there's just no physical way to go back. We're down on the other side of the mountains now. We also don't have any food, and so he is forced into this decision and goes on this adventure down the Amazon. Thank goodness, because they wrote down what they did and it was incredible. But sometimes your hands are tied, and that's just I always call it the war dragon. The war dragon's like, I'm taking you, and we're going on this ride, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, that's certainly Tolstoy's philosophy. If you read War and Peace, the end of War and Peace is after he's wrapped up the movie part of War and Peace, right? And Pierre and Natasha are together, and they have lovely children, and everybody lives happily ever after. After that, he gets into a long digression about war. And it's Tolstoy's theory that there were no great commanders, that once you engage, everything's up for grabs. And fate really takes over.
Boy, oh boy.
And I'm not sure I agree with that, because I do see a certain amount of planning and cunning behind these commanders. On the other hand, there's Clausewitzian friction. You don't know what's going to happen. As I mentioned, a bridge could get blown too early. This happened to Napoleon leaving Leipzig. He was trying to get his army out the only way he could. He was losing this battle, which followed his retreat from Moscow. And some junior officer was set to blow up the bridge. Well, he blew it up while the French were on it, not after they had crossed. And then he was supposed to blow it up. So that cost Napoleon a lot. The men, the other guys were captured. They couldn't get out. And that was just pure luck of the draw, luck of the battlefield. Or as Tolstoy says, it's all God's will. You can die in your sleep, and you can survive the battlefield. You have no idea what's in store for you. And it's a very humbling thing to read about warfare with this point of view.
Yeah, I remember being in the main operations center in Baghdad, and they had found some just some old, old ordnance, so a couple $100 worth of old shells. Who knows if they're there or not? But they shut that entire place down. All they could focus on was these 50-year-old Korean era shells that were rusted, and maybe they blow up, maybe they don't. But the amount of college degrees that are in this room, the amount of money, and it looks like Space Command when you're in this thing. It's multiple tiered desks. There's a buzz on the room. Shut that place down because somewhere close by, not on the post, they found some shells. And you think about that goes right to that thing. Like, what are you going to do? Your entire multinational task force, at the very top has been brought to a halt because of this little cache of weapons. That doesn't align with a lot of success and purposeful winning, and then you see the result, and we don't win there, right? And I always like to say, and I'm pretty tough on these commanders, but they can take it. They were the guys wearing the stars. They're all for their careers. By the way, so am I. So, if we don't accept those things, then there's a whole lot more Tolstoy in our reality than we're probably comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the feminization of the military, that when the safety of your army becomes the only thing that matters, don't fight. These guys sign up to be safe. They signed up to fight, or they were impressed into service to fight. Their job is to fight. For example, Ireland has some UN peacekeepers that were between the Israelis and the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And the Irish politicians were saying, oh, thank God our men are safe. It's up to the Israelis to keep them safe. They're in a war zone, dude. And you put them there between combatants. And at some point, safety first ain't going to cut it. You have to understand what can happen, what is likely to happen. But you don't send soldiers into a war zone with the instructions to lose or to tie. If you look what Roosevelt said after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he's very clear. You can't imagine an American president saying, we're going to fight this to the end, when we will win through. Victory is the only option here. Not a negotiated settlement, not a loss, victory. And you think Patton would have said, well, he was furious when I finally held him up and wouldn't let him go to Berlin because we needed to give that to the Russians for political reasons. And Patton was clearly not a political general. That's why he got cashiered a couple of times.
Right.
But you can't fight a war to tie. You just cannot. And we've done that. And what have we got to show for it? They're over, literally over.
Yeah, walking around and seeing the things that we did, reading this history, I'm like, these things just don't look like. So you could be on a post in Iraq or Afghanistan, and you see a soldier who's not a combat soldier, right? And look, I'm not saying anything bad about these folks, but their job is going to always be on a post, and they have on gloves, eye protection, a helmet, body, like all these things walking around. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we doing if we have to take all these measures? When I deployed to Bosnia, there's a general there. He's like, my number one goal is force protection. I'm like, then send us to Kansas, right in the middle of Kansas.
Then
why are we here?
Right. Yeah. Force protection is absurd because it tells you you're not in it to win it. You're in it not to be too humbled or embarrassed by the enemy. And that's an alien attitude that's only crept into the American military, I think, in the last 50 or 60 years. No American serviceman would have subscribed to that. In World War II, 16-year-olds were lying about their age to get into the Army so they could fight. They weren't getting into the Army for a career or to get free training or learn how to be an airline pilot or any of that stuff. They were in it to fight. And they were in it to follow the commanders that they loved, like Patton, who they hated and loved, and that's what you want if you're a commander, to the end, to win. Once winning is not important, Al Davis was right. It's not it's the only thing. But we've lost that as Americans, and our country has suffered terribly from this attitude, I believe. And I'm a Vietnam generation. I had a student deferment because I was in college before I turned 18. And in those days, People often say to me, "Oh, well, look at you, Mr. Big Shot. You dodged Vietnam." I said, "No, actually, I did what my country asked me. If you a certain level of high school scholar, you got into university, and that's what your country wanted you to do." Yeah. So, as I said, I was already in college by the time I had to register, and then I went through the lottery like every other kid, and they just fell short of my number. So my number was, I think, 201, and they called up to 195, and then you were done. So that's that. But even in Vietnam, people didn't fight to lose. They may have thought, it's all the things people say about the Army. It's disorganized and it's crazy and it's stupid. And we've all read Catch-22 or Norman Mailer, James Jones, all of these books. And they do show the crazy side of war.
Sure.
But then again, there's the Kubrick side of war. And there is the Caesar side of war and the Alexander side of war. And there's a lot of that's gone out of the American character. I think it's very harmful.
Yeah. Let's get back into it. By the way, the book is called The Rage to Conquer, and it's fantastic. I've been enjoying reading through it. You guys always know what I say. Buy 2 of these things. I'll put the link into the show notes right here, and you can get one of those. Well, you can get it in January. So if you're watching this before January 2025, just click the link and pre-buy it. That's always the best way to do it. Buy 2 of them. That's what I like to do. You're talking about all of this stuff that gets between a unit and victory, whatever it is, whether it's like all this stuff you have to wear to go and be in the mayor's cell, right? God bless you. You got to have these other jobs. You got to manage the camp and make sure the stuff gets there. You have to do that. But when you get out and the tactics, this is the modern combat thing. And I want you to tie this back into the thing I discovered, because I would stay in the area and the unit would rotate over the top of me. So a new unit would come in and I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys were pulling out the same playbook. You've been taught the same things. That didn't work the last time. It's going to take you 3 months to get up to speed. You got 4 months of operational, and then you start shutting down. By the way, you have no idea what 3 units ago, what they did, total amnesia, total disregard. And so one of the things I would do, Michael, is I would take the last 4 units slide decks. We're going to fight the war with the rehab, the radio in a box. And I'd be like, here's the last 4 slides. You can do whatever you guys want. I'm all on board. I'm here to help you. But what are we going to do different than these last 4 units? I thought they were going to do the same thing. And slowly, I could get the unit to slow down and just make fewer mistakes. And I always say, when I'm doing my collection, my espionage stuff, I'm trying to help the commander win more, lose less, and help the enemy lose more and win less. And so if I can get us to make less mistakes, man, it pays off. We still didn't hardly get to the part where we could make the dead Taliban show up because they didn't want to fight us. They would disappear, or our process to go fight them, to get permission, would be so ponderous. We think we have this very, the responsibility and the effort is pushed down low, but try to get a helicopter to show up, with this asset and this asset. Now that takes 2 to 3 weeks. And the Taliban just cannot perform that.
No. Well, I think we've lost sight of the most important thing. You know what they say is amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. What is possible? Yeah. But the thing that often doesn't get talked about is what is the objective? As I said, Roosevelt's very clear: total victory. Grant was extremely clear: unconditional surrender. That's it. We're not going to talk about it. I'm going to take your surrender, and this war will be over the day I do. And so the objective is victory. The objective now is not victory. It's many things, everything but victory. Political correctness. Something that drives me crazy when I hear about it is proportional response. There's no such thing as a proportional response, especially in asymmetric warfare.
Right.
When you've been attacked, so they killed 2,000 of our people, so now we can kill 2,001 of their people. We'll call it even. Yeah. That's ridiculous. Yeah. And the Romans would have said, how about we kill every one of them and then destroy the city and sow salt in it, and it will never come back to threaten us again. How about that for an objective? And we would say, oh, we can't do that. That, as Barack Obama would say, that's not who we are. Well, it used to be who we are. And if you doubt it, go visit the Confederacy if you can find it, because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said there. In our modern times, we have this conflict between Israel and their neighbors, and everybody's talking about a ceasefire. We've done that. Israel's saying no thanks. By the way, so is the enemy. And if the enemy didn't have any more fight left in them, this thing would be over. But
That's when wars end. I mean,
right.
Sherman says that the more of them you kill and the more of their stuff they destroy, the faster this is going to be over, and the more merciful it's going to be for everybody. And that seems now in our polite society counterintuitive. But it's actually,
it was counterintuitive back then. He's like, I need 300,000 men to make this thing happen. And, he was almost dead right on the numbers that he called for. We didn't like it then. We don't like it now, but it's not changing.
No, I think Americans are not, despite what everybody says about us, we're not particularly empire builders. We're not out for conquest. We conquered the continental United States, and that was pretty much it. We didn't really want the Philippines, and we were happy to get rid of them. We didn't really want some of these other overseas possessions. We do want to be left alone. We're like the armadillo. We're protected by our oceans, but if you bite us, we're going to fight back. But now we've lost the fight back. So we've lost all these wars in a row because the objective wasn't clear. And as a fighting man yourself, if you don't know what you're fighting for, you're not fighting for anything other than, is my time up and can I go home? And that's when you get that, that rotation is a problem. And Napoleon, the reason his army worked is he developed the corps system. So he would split his grande armée, big army, hundreds of thousands of guys, into 3 or 4 separate corps. And then they would be mini armies of themselves. They'd go out, they'd live off the land, they were able to maneuver. His commanders had operational authority in almost any sphere that they wanted it. But when he needed them, he could bring them all together as rapidly in a way that astounded the European contemporaries. He used lighter cannons for one thing, so that helped him pick up speed. It was always about speed and surprise, and where does the enemy least expect me? At his back door tomorrow morning at 2 a.m. And that's what he would do. And he would pull all those corps together, and then bang, they whopped everybody they fought. And it was like the first Greek phalanxes with the sarissas. No one could figure out a defense against it. So now we fight these indeterminate wars for reasons that are not fully understood. And we demand that our young women and now young men, and unfortunately now our young women, are being killed for nothing, really nothing. And I think that would have to make me quite angry if I were still of military service age.
Yeah, sure. I mean, these wars, we talked about this a little bit earlier, it's a great sorting. It's a great proving of who you are. And if you're the kind of person that has to go and do those kind of things, you get a chance to. When you miss out, I mean, I talked to a lot of my friends like, I wish I would have done service of some kind, and that hole is in us because we're dudes and we want to go out and measure up, and have that chance. Because ultimately,
it's a masculine thing. It is.
Yeah. Right.
So think about the great war book, The Red Badge of Courage, which everybody reads in high school and misses the entire point of. I don't know why they give that book to kids to read. And it was written by a guy who never saw combat, who died very, very young. He was in his 20s when he died. But what's that book about? It's about fresh recruits in the Union Army that are going into combat for the first time. And what are they worried about? Will I be scared and will I run?
Right.
Will my courage stick to the point where I will willingly do what's asked of me, even though it's incredibly dangerous? Patton says this in his famous speech, that obscenity-laced speech that we all know from the movie, to those men. And he says, some of you are nervous that you're going to chicken out. And he says, you will not. He makes a very good point, too, which is, and most civilians don't understand this, your chance of actually getting killed in battle is really amazingly low. It's like 2%, right?
Yeah.
In a big clash of arms, in an old-fashioned World War II style clash of arms. But it seems that from the earliest times to the present, young men want that experience. In the Civil War, the Union troops called it going to see the elephant. No one had ever seen an elephant before growing up in rural Massachusetts. But the elephant was combat for the first time. How will you react? Will you be afraid? Will you chicken out? Will you run? Will you be brave? It's something every young man wants to test himself against. And I know a lot of the women in the audience won't understand that, but I believe that's entirely true. It's always been true of young men, and hopefully will remain so.
Yeah, that is super true. By the way, you can see elephants in the Alps sometimes if you're in a combat unit.
Well, yeah, Hannibal surprised the Romans with those elephants, that's for sure.
Yeah, and he can also, look ahead and he can pin you against the edge of a lake and say, "Good luck. You're gonna have to fight in this water," And so we do.
Well, think about that for a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
Kane. Okay.
Yeah.
Estimates are between 50 and 75,000 Romans got killed in that battle. It destroyed the Roman army in one day by hand. They didn't use tactical nukes on them. They stabbed them with swords or lances. And that battlefield must have been unbelievably awful.
Yeah.
And the Romans, if they had been any less than they were, would have folded at that point, and Hannibal would have rampaged up and down the Italian peninsula. What saved the Romans is their women. The Roman women knew their job was to produce soldiers for the legions. That was it. That's their job. And so the Romans could replace those 75,000 guys very quickly. Nowadays, you couldn't. You wouldn't have the manpower. Yeah. But the sexual balance in Rome was men do this, women do that. Rome was an entirely militarized society. Everyone was in the military, whether he thought he was or he wasn't. He was a professional soldier or raised by one of the commanders as a new part of a legion. And the women knew they had to keep having children in order to make Rome continue to function. And when women stopped having children is when Rome collapsed. That's really what did them in. It wasn't so much the immigration, although there was this huge wave, this great migration from east to west. That's not what did them in. What did them in is, if you read Gibbon, say, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the women stopped having children and the men became cowards. And Gibbon calls them out. He calls them effeminate on many occasions. And he says, the young men trembled at the sound of the trumpet, which was the call to war. They didn't want to fight anymore. Yeah. And so they're gone.
Yeah.
It's a tough truth, but it is the truth. And it's the only conclusion you can come to when you've studied this the way I have, or anyone who's been in the service or had that experience understands this instinctively.
Yeah. You talked before about that quote about experts and novices talk about tactics. I challenge that now in the modern sense because our tactics are so far removed from what it takes to win. If we don't have that knowledge, I feel like we spend a whole lot of time talking to people. Heck, that's my job, talking to people. We don't have any kind of licensing on how to work with an interpreter. We have no you can't jump out of an airplane without going to airplane jumping out school. Yeah. But you can go negotiate with farmers, having never had that skill at all. You're 22 years old, you're a lieutenant. You're like, go negotiate with that farmer through an interpreter that you don't know how to operate properly. And so all these day-to-day interactions, and I'm just using these examples. There's a ton of these. We got prepared, all the sayings like, a gallon of sweat, drop of blood kind of ratio thing. We didn't fight that many people. You compare like the Battle of the Somme or any of these other battles,
that's
Iwo Jima, right? compared to like we lost 2,000. I'm not making light of any kind of soldier casualties, but the
No.
amount of people you lost and the percentage that are actually lost in combat, as you said earlier,
Yeah.
it's tiny compared to what we're supposed to do if we're going to win.
Well, I was thinking of Peleliu too, which was a completely pointless battle
Yeah.
that was fought by the Marines, of course. At MacArthur, who last time I looked wasn't a Marine, to make him look good so he could have his photo op in the Philippines. I came away with tremendous contempt for MacArthur, just so you know. I think he's the most overrated figure, American military figure of the 20th century. But a lot of boys died at Peleliu for absolutely no reason. Or Gallipoli, early in the First World War, where these guys were the Charge of the Light Brigade, or any of these things where these units are sacrificed. But I think the point of that comment was that it's easy to say, well, I would have moved this army here and moved that army there. But someone who's in the army said, yeah, but there was this mountain in the way and there was no pass over it and you had to do this. So it's going to take you X more days. And at this point, the enemy is already gone, or you've been defeated, or you're all in slavery, in chains, being taken back to Assyria or somewhere. So it's easy to second guess. And I hope I've tried successfully not to do that, but rather in Rage to Conquer, but to explain what was the thought process. And they do have these examples, as I mentioned. Beaumont, if he knew about this to Caesar, I don't know that he did or didn't, but he was a warrior, did the same thing Caesar did effectively in order to get himself out of this pickle that he was in. And they used to study this, but they don't study it anymore. They don't say, okay, so you find yourself, here's the situation, blah, 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 blah. It's exactly analogous to pick your battle, right? Napoleon at this, or Caesar here. And then here's the terrain map, here's the disposition of forces, here's the material, where's your fuel deep. It's stuff like fuel. If you read about Patton, he's a tank commander. He was an early adopter of the tank, and he understood tanks are only as good as you have gas for them. And when they run out, they just sit there, and then they're useless. Well, much of this was about, where do we get fuel? Caesar's always writing about, where do I get grain to feed my men and my animals? Because you've got to feed the horses, or they're going to poop out too. They don't last that long without food. These that seem mundane and aren't really the glamour part of war are so very important. And it's not a coincidence that many of our greatest commanders were also quartermasters at some point. So they were all about the disposition of material and force. Grant started out as a quartermaster, which is why he was such the right guy at the right time for the Union Army in the Civil War. Grant was, he wasn't physically big. He was kind of little, actually. He was middle in his class. He had a couple things going for him. One was he was the greatest horseman in the Army. Apparently, he was just magic on a horse, even better than Phil Sheridan and Custer, who were both cavalry commanders under him. And he'd get a horse to do anything, and he distinguished himself during the Mexican War. And he also got to watch guys like what was his name? Was he president for a while? I've forgotten. One of the Hancock, to Old Fuss and Feathers, to see how they commanded in the field at these pivotal battles in that war, which he didn't like, by the way. He liked the Mexicans. He thought the war was a disgrace, and it was just bullies beating up on a country that couldn't fight the Americans. But he was a quartermaster, and so he knew how to move stuff around, and he knew what was possible. So I think the good commander, you learn, never orders his men to do something that they cannot literally do. They may have to work hard and find depths in them when it comes to courage and resourcefulness, but not stuff. That's a whole separate wing of the fight.
History's full of these guys that don't fit the archetype. So you have a guy like Grant. There's a guy who won the Medal of Honor during the Indian Wars. His name was Powhatan Clark, and he was last in his class at West Point. And a lot of these last in the class guys, like Navy and everything else, they tend to find that thing because they don't they don't do the political straightforward, this is how we outwork the enemy or whatever kind of answer. They're like, why don't we just go kill them?
Yeah.
There's so many of these guys.
What's their belief?
Or Kit Carson. How invaluable is a guy like Kit Carson? You wouldn't say that guy's some kind of magical combat warrior, but there he is helping us win a war.
Yeah, it's hard for an army to make allowances for a one-off genius, as Custer was in cavalry tactics. He was lucky. He referred to Custer luck all the time till it ran out. He was completely fearless. Bullets literally bounced off of him. They'd hit him in the scabbard. They never hit him. And he could kill you with his saber on horseback. He was a tremendous horseman, and he was incredibly effective at the end when Grant's pinned down at Petersburg, and it's Little Phil and his cavalry burning the Shenandoah Valley. So the Confederates literally had run out of gas on every possible front. So they actually win that battle for Grant, and then Lee has to flee Petersburg, and then he's trapped at Appomattox Courthouse. But those one-off guys are tricky. Like Patton, he slapped a soldier, they cashiered him. When they gave him an army, he won that war. And it's a point I make at the end of the book. It's kind of it's bittersweet. Once Patton was finished with war was finished with him, and he dies in this freak car accident a few months after the end of the war. That as he even understood it, his usefulness to the gods now was at an end. What do you do with Patton? Nimitz almost got cashiered when he was a young sub officer because he ran the sub aground. And it was only because he was such a good officer that they only gave him a letter of reprimand, and they didn't court-martial him, which is what would have happened. Usually, in the old days, if you ran your ship aground, that was the end of your command, and you were out of the Navy. Now we let it slide, but they did make an exception for Nimitz because, after all, he was the guy that won the Battle of Midway, wasn't he? He would go on to be that guy. So they understood that Nimitz had this intuitive sense of strategy and tactics and everything that makes a great commander.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep too much longer because I know you got to go, but I do want to say one more dude. I want to leave him out because I love who he was and how he approached it. Will Cushing from the Navy doesn't even graduate from the Naval Academy. He talks his way by talking to the Secretary of the Navy. He's like, please, can I go fight? And they're like, what the hell? You're crazy. And so he did. He fought like a demon, and it was incredible. So the book, everybody, is right here. It comes out January 2025, and it's called A Rage to Conquer. And it's Michael's book. It's his latest one. Do go get it. Buy 2. There's the link down below. And so any closing remarks? Otherwise, we'll wrap this thing up.
No, I just think that I hope that readers enjoy it. I thank them for making Last Stand such a hit that this book was called into being, and that I hope there's some lessons that we can learn, especially as men, that need to be relearned for our country to continue to exist in the form in which we love it. So
I love it. All right, stay there. I'll be right back to say goodbye to you. Everybody else, I'll talk to you next time.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break It Down Show.